Hey there, sleepless rabble. Come in, get settled. I'll take it from here. Tonight, we're back in our freak show series. Another case, another man who managed to turn human beings into objects, and somehow walk through life looking perfectly ordinary while doing it. If you want this freak show to continue, do the usual things. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't, drop a comment. It keeps these stories alive and visible. Now get comfortable, this is Napmax Stories, and tonight's exhibit is a man who violently ended the lives of 3 men and left behind more questions than answers. As always, we start at the beginning. Jason Barnum did not grow up in what people like to call a perfect storm. There is no record of ritual abuse, no sensational courtroom testimony about unspeakable horrors behind closed doors. No single event that can be pointed to as the moment everything went wrong. What is documented is something far less dramatic and far more common. Barnum's childhood environment was unstable and emotionally thin. The kind of household where structure exists on paper, but connection does not. Adults are present, but not reliably available. Needs are technically met, but rarely acknowledged. There is no sense of safety that comes from being seen or understood. This matters because neglect does not announce itself the way violence does. It doesn't leave obvious scars, it leaves gaps. Accounts from Barnum's early life suggest a lack of consistent emotional attachment. No stable figure who anchored him, no strong relational framework that taught him how closeness works, how conflict resolves, or how other people matter beyond their immediate function. Importantly, there is no clear evidence of extreme physical abuse. That distinction is often uncomfortable for true crime narratives, because it removes the easy explanation. There is no clean cause and effect storyline here. No dramatic origin story that makes later violence feel inevitable. Instead, what seems to form is a slow internal withdrawal. Barnum appears to have grown up learning that emotional engagement leads nowhere. That expressing needs is pointless. That other people are unreliable at best, irrelevant at worst. Over time, this doesn't produce visible chaos. It produces detachment. By the time he reaches adolescence, there is already a sense of distance. Not the loud kind that gets teachers involved, but the quiet kind that passes unnoticed. He isn't remembered as a constant troublemaker. He isn't flagged as dangerous. He simply doesn't integrate. This is where many systems fail to react, because there is nothing concrete to react to. No criminal behavior, no explosive incidents. Just a person who never quite connects. Barnum's childhood doesn't read like a horror story. It reads like an emotional vacuum. One where empathy isn't actively destroyed, but never properly built in the first place. And that distinction will matter later. Because people who grow up without emotional anchors don't necessarily become violent. Many don't. But when violence does emerge later, it often carries a specific quality. It isn't reactive. It isn't emotional. It feels procedural. This chapter doesn't exist to excuse anything. It exists to show that the foundation was not chaos. It was absence. And absence, when left unchecked, has a way of shaping everything that follows. By the time Jason Barnum reached adolescence, nothing about him screamed, problem case. That, in hindsight, is part of the issue. There are no records of dramatic school incidents, no expulsions that made headlines, no early criminal pattern that would later be quoted as a warning sign everyone somehow missed. Teachers didn't describe him as volatile or threatening. Peers didn't describe him as charismatic or dominant. What comes through instead is something far more muted. Distance. Barnum struggled socially, but not in a way that triggered intervention. He wasn't loudly disruptive. He didn't seek attention through chaos. He hovered at the edges. Present, but disconnected. Group dynamics didn't stick, friendships didn't last. Emotional reciprocity seemed limited, as if he was observing rather than participating. This is where many people expect the usual red flags to appear. They don't. There is no documented history of animal cruelty, no fascination with fire, no early sexual offences, no pattern of escalating violence in his youth. That absence matters because it places Barnum outside the familiar checklist. He does not fit the textbook future serial offender profile people like to retroactively impose. What is noticeable is a growing inability to form meaningful connections. Empathy appears shallow, not absent, but underdeveloped. Emotional responses are blunted. Conflict doesn't escalate into rage, it dissolves into withdrawal. Barnum doesn't act out, he checks out. In school and early social settings, that kind of personality often slips through the cracks. There is nothing to discipline, nothing to punish, nothing urgent to address. Systems are designed to respond to noise, not silence. As a result, Barnum moves forward without correction, without guidance, without confrontation. He learns how to exist alongside others without actually engaging with them. People become background elements rather than participants in his inner world. This is not a dramatic transformation. It's incremental. Years of minimal connection slowly reinforcing the same internal lesson. Others don't matter much, and neither does being understood by them. By the time he enters adulthood, this pattern is already set. Not because someone failed once, but because nothing ever happened loudly enough to force a response. Barnum's youth is unsettling precisely because it looks ordinary. Not broken, not explosive, just quietly detached. And detachment, when it hardens over time, doesn't announce what it's becoming. By adulthood, Jason Barnum is capable of forming relationships, at least on the surface. He dates, he interacts, he appears functional enough to pass through everyday life without raising concern. But these connections never stabilize. They don't deepen. They don't last. Romantic relationships are short-lived and tense. Partners later describe him as emotionally cold, difficult to read, and increasingly controlling. There is a consistent pattern. Closeness is tolerated only as long as it does not require vulnerability. Barnum does not open up. He doesn't share emotional weight. When expectations of reciprocity arise, empathy, compromise, emotional presence, friction follows. Not explosive arguments, but pressure, subtle control, withdrawal. What stands out is how quickly irritation appears when he feels challenged or disrespected. Criticism isn't processed, it's rejected. Disagreement isn't negotiated, it's perceived as a threat to control. Instead of repairing conflict, Barnum distances himself or tightens his grip on the situation. These relationships don't end with dramatic scenes, they erode. Partners report a sense of being managed rather than known. Conversations feel transactional. Affection feels conditional. Barnum appears more interested in maintaining dominance than building mutual trust. Importantly, there is no indication of performative charm. He isn't a manipulative seducer or a charismatic abuser. There is no grand love-bombing phase. What exists instead is emotional scarcity, a limited range of engagement that never expands. This makes the relationships exhausting rather than intoxicating. There is nothing to romanticize, no intensity that later gets reframed as passion, just a persistent imbalance. Barnum wants proximity, but only on his terms. He wants access without obligation, presence without accountability. When that balance tips, the connection loses its usefulness. What becomes clear is that relationships are not experienced as shared emotional spaces. They are environments to be controlled, entered, or exited depending on comfort. Other people are not partners, they are variables. This chapter matters because it shows continuity. There is no sudden shift from normal to dangerous. The same emotional structure appears here that shaped his youth and psychological drift. Detachment paired with control. Barnum does not struggle because he wants connection and fails. He struggles because connection itself is not the goal. And when relationships are reduced to functions, empathy becomes optional. That pattern doesn't announce catastrophe. It simply reinforces a worldview where other people exist nearby, but never fully count. When it comes to sexuality, Jason Barnum doesn't fit the sensational templates people often expect. There is no clear catalogue of exotic paraphilias, no neatly defined fetish that can be highlighted and explained away. What appears instead is something simpler and more troubling. Sex is not about closeness for Barnum. It is not about mutual desire, connection, or vulnerability. What consistently surfaces is control. Accounts and psychological assessments point toward dominance-driven fantasies, where power matters more than intimacy. The presence of another person is not experienced as an equal exchange, but as a situation to be managed. Consent, emotion, reciprocity, these are secondary considerations, if they register at all. This is where the line between sexuality and violence begins to blur. Importantly, violence is not a means to sexual gratification in the conventional sense. There is no indication that Barnum commits violence in order to reach a sexual outcome. Instead, both sex and violence appear to draw from the same underlying need: absolute authority over another human being. Control is the reward. This distinction matters. It places Barnum outside the category of impulsive, lust-driven offenders. His actions are not fueled by desperation or loss of restraint. They are structured, purposeful, internally coherent. There is also no evidence of escalating experimentation in public view. No visible rehearsal phase. No outward signs that would alert people around him. What exists happens internally, where fantasy is not challenged by reality or consequence. Barnum does not seek emotional affirmation through sex. He seeks confirmation of dominance. The other person's role is not to connect, but to submit, physically, psychologically, or symbolically. This creates a dangerous dynamic. When intimacy is stripped of its emotional dimension, the human body becomes a tool rather than a boundary. And when boundaries lose meaning, harm becomes easier to rationalize. At this stage, nothing has crossed into public violence yet. There are still no crimes that attract attention. But the internal framework is now fully formed. People are objects, power is stabilizing, and empathy is optional. This chapter does not suggest inevitability. Many individuals with dominance-oriented fantasies never commit violent crimes. But in Barnum's case, the alignment is clear. His emotional, detachment, need for control, and absence of relational grounding converge into a worldview where harm can exist without internal resistance. Sex here is not a motive. It is a context. And within that context, the idea of another person's autonomy holds very little weight. What comes next is not a sudden escalation. It is an application. The logic is already in place. Jason Barnum's crimes took place in Florida in the mid-2000s. By the time investigators realized they were dealing with a single offender, multiple men were already dead. Barnum killed at least 3 victims. The confirmed cases involved adult men, some of whom were socially marginalized and living unstable lives. This detail would later matter, not because it excuses anything, but because it explains why the crimes did not immediately trigger widespread attention. The killings were violent and personal. Barnum did not attack from a distance. He did not rely on quick methods meant to minimize contact. These were close-range crimes, involving prolonged physical control over the victim. In at least one confirmed case, and likely more, the victim's eyes were forcibly removed. This detail became public during the investigation and court proceedings, and it is the reason the media later attached the nickname eyeball killer to Barnum. At the time of the crimes themselves, however, there was no nickname, no narrative, and no public framing. There were only crime scenes. The bodies showed signs of extreme brutality. This was not violence meant simply to kill. The injuries indicated domination, restraint, and deliberate harm beyond what would have been necessary to cause death. Investigators noted the severity immediately, even before any broader connections were made. Despite this, the early cases were not instantly linked. The crimes occurred at different times and locations. Without a clear pattern visible from the outside, each case was initially treated on its own. There was no early declaration of a serial offender operating in the area. Barnum did not contact police. He did not taunt investigators. He did not attempt to publicize the crimes. There were no messages, no symbols left behind, no effort to be noticed. From a law enforcement perspective, what they had were isolated acts of extreme violence without an obvious connective thread. From Barnum's perspective, the crimes were controlled, intentional, and completed without interruption. By the time investigators began comparing details across cases, injuries, methods, circumstances, the reality became unavoidable. These were not unrelated events. They were part of a pattern. But by then, the violence had already occurred. Barnum did not become notorious because of how he looked or what he believed. He became known because he killed, brutally, directly, and without spectacle. Everything that follows builds on this. Not theory, not myth, but acts that cannot be undone. The removal of the eyes was not incidental. It was not random brutality. And it was not performed for shock value or public reaction. At the time of the crimes, no one knew this detail would later define the case. There was no nickname yet. No media framing. Just crime scenes revealing an act that stood out for its specificity. Eyes are not simply organs. They are how we recognize one another, how we confirm presence, how we register fear, resistance, and awareness. Eye contact establishes that the person in front of you is conscious, perceiving, and real. Removing that eliminates the last remaining form of confrontation. For someone driven by control, the eyes represent the final obstacle. They witness, they judge, they reflect humanity back to the offender. Taking them removes not just sight, but acknowledgement. In Barnum's case, this act fits seamlessly into his existing behavioral structure. Emotional detachment, objectification, dominance. The goal was not ritual. There is no evidence of belief systems, trophies, or symbolic messaging meant for an audience. The act served a function. A body without eyes cannot see, it cannot recognize, it cannot return a gaze. That matters when dominance is the primary objective. Importantly, there is no indication that Barnum preserved the eyes, displayed them, or attempted to turn the act into a signature meant for recognition. This was not branding. It was completion. The nickname eyeball killer would come later, imposed by media once the detail became public. Barnum himself showed no interest in that framing. The act was never about being known for it. This chapter is not about sensationalism. It is about clarity. The removal of the eyes marks the point where violence moves beyond killing and into absolute erasure. Not just ending life, but removing identity, perception, and presence itself. It is the purest expression of Barnum's internal logic. Not rage, not impulse, Control carried to its final point. When people look back at this case, one question comes up almost immediately. How did this go on without being recognized as a series? The answer is not incompetence, it's structure. In the early stages, Jason Barnum's crimes enter the system as separate events. Different dates, different locations, different victims with fragile social footprints. Each case arrived with its own file, its own lead investigator, its own limited pool of information. Nothing about them demanded immediate consolidation. Law enforcement works on thresholds. Patterns have to cross them before alarms sound. In this case, those thresholds were slow to be reached. Part of the delay came down to visibility. Some of the victims did not have strong family networks pushing for answers. Missing person reports were inconsistent. Timelines were incomplete. In several instances, there was simply not enough contextual data to force a connection early on. Another factor was geography and jurisdiction. Crimes occurring across different areas don't automatically land on the same desk. Without a highly distinctive signature that clearly links cases, violent deaths are often processed locally before anyone zooms out. And at this stage, there was no obvious calling card being publicly recognized. No messages left behind, no communication with police, no deliberate attempt to announce a series. Barnum wasn't performing. He wasn't demanding attention. That silence worked in his favor. From an investigative standpoint, what existed were brutal but seemingly isolated incidents. Each one serious, each one disturbing, but none on its own screaming serial offender loudly enough to override normal procedure. This is where reality clashes with true crime expectations. In documentaries, connections are often instant. In real life, they require time, comparison, and the uncomfortable admission that separate tragedies may be linked. The system did not fail because it ignored violence. It lagged because the violence did not present itself as connected. Only when investigators began comparing injury patterns, methods, and circumstances across cases did the picture start to change. Details that seemed incidental in isolation began to repeat. Similarities stopped being coincidences. By then, the delay had already served its purpose. Barnum had not relied on clever tricks or elaborate concealment. He relied on fragmentation, on the fact that systems are designed to handle individual cases first, patterns second. This chapter matters because it shows how easily extreme violence can exist in pieces without immediately forming a recognizable whole. Not through chaos, but through procedural order. Nothing was ignored, nothing was dismissed. It simply took time to see the shape of what was happening. And once that shape emerged, the investigation shifted gears. The next phase was no longer about isolated crimes. It was about identifying a single hand behind them, and stopping it. The shift doesn't happen all at once. There is no dramatic meeting, no sudden revelation pinned to a whiteboard with red string. What changes is quieter than that, but decisive. Investigators begin to compare notes. As files are reviewed side by side, certain details stop looking incidental. Injury patterns align. The level of force used feels familiar. The circumstances surrounding the victims start to echo one another. What once seemed like unrelated brutality begins to form a recognizable shape. This is the moment where perspective widens. Instead of asking, "What happened here?" investigators start asking, "Who does this resemble?" Instead of treating each case as a closed system, they are examined as part of a developing whole. The similarities are not theatrical. There is no flamboyant signature meant to announce authorship. What connects the cases is restraint and repetition, the same type of control, the same escalation of harm, the same absence of chaos. That consistency matters. It suggests intention rather than impulse, planning rather than panic. A single offender applying the same internal logic across different situations. Once that conclusion is reached, the investigation changes speed. Resources shift. Information flows differently. Cases that once sat in separate jurisdictions are now actively cross-referenced. Witness statements are re-evaluated. Timelines are aligned. The question is no longer whether these crimes are connected. It's how long they have been. Importantly, Barnum has still done nothing to draw attention to himself. No letters, no taunts, no attempt to provoke the police into recognizing him. The pattern emerges despite his silence, not because of it. That silence now becomes another data point. Offenders who seek notoriety tend to escalate publicly once patterns are noticed. Barnum does not. There is no behavioral shift aimed at visibility. That reinforces the assessment investigators are beginning to form. This is not about recognition. It is about execution. Victims had been found in areas that, while not identical, intersected in meaningful ways. Locations where certain people moved repeatedly. Places that allowed privacy without isolation, access without attention. When investigators mapped those movements, a limited pool of names surfaced. Individuals who appeared near more than one relevant site, or who had contact with people connected to multiple victims. Jason Barnum was one of those names. At first, he was not singled out. He did not stand out as flamboyant or volatile. He was not someone already known for violent crime at that scale. What placed him on the radar was proximity, physical and circumstantial, combined with inconsistencies that became harder to ignore once files were viewed together. Witness statements placed Barnum in overlapping environments. Timelines that once seemed harmless began to clash. Movements that looked incidental in isolation became notable when aligned across cases. None of this was dramatic on its own. Together, it formed pressure. Investigators also noted behavioral alignment. Barnum fit the emerging offender profile in ways that were difficult to dismiss. Controlled, quiet, non-reactive, and operating without a desire for attention. He was not someone seeking recognition, which matched the absence of taunting or public messaging. Once focus narrowed, surveillance and background checks followed. Routine procedures, not cinematic breakthroughs. What mattered was accumulation. Small confirmations stacking until coincidence was no longer a defensible explanation. When law enforcement moved to arrest Barnum, there was no confrontation. He did not attempt to flee. He did not resist. He did not protest loudly or claim misunderstanding. The arrest unfolded calmly, almost mechanically. This reaction was notable. There was no visible shock, no emotional spike, no collapse under pressure. Barnum appeared to understand that the sequence had reached its end. Not emotionally, but structurally. The same control that defined his actions appeared in how he accepted the loss of control. During the arrest, he did not volunteer explanations. He did not attempt to shape a narrative. He complied, answered what was required, and remained largely affectless. This was not surrender in the dramatic sense. It was acknowledgement. The violence stopped at that point. Not because of a confession or revelation, but because the system finally closed in on the right individual. From here on, the story no longer unfolds in streets or isolated spaces. It moves into interview rooms and court filings, places where silence can no longer function as cover. The arrest marks the end of action and the beginning of accountability. What comes next is not pursuit. It is interrogation, and the question of what Jason Barnum is willing to say once he no longer controls the environment. Once Jason Barnum is in custody, the atmosphere shifts, but not in the way many expect. There is no dramatic unraveling, no emotional collapse, no sudden flood of explanations that promise clarity or relief. The interrogations are controlled, quiet, and procedural. Barnum does not enter the interview room in a state of panic. He does not appear confused about why he is there. From the outset, he understands the position he is in and the leverage law enforcement now holds. What he does not display is urgency, not to defend himself, not to confess, not to justify. When he speaks, it is measured. Barnum answers questions selectively. He does not volunteer information out of emotional pressure, nor does he attempt to bargain through storytelling. There is no effort to humanize himself in the eyes of investigators, no attempt to redirect blame, no visible interest in how his words might be interpreted outside the room. This is not silence, but it isn't openness either. Investigators later describe his cooperation as functional rather than sincere. He provides details when asked directly. He confirms certain facts. He does not obstruct for the sake of obstruction, but there is a clear boundary. He gives information without giving himself. What is notably absent is remorse. Barnum does not express regret in a way that suggests emotional understanding of harm. There are no apologies directed at victims, no language indicating guilt or internal conflict. His tone remains flat, almost administrative. Actions are described without reflection. Outcomes are acknowledged without emotional weight. This lack of effect is not performative defiance. It is consistent with everything seen so far. Barnum does not react as someone overwhelmed by consequences. He reacts as someone whose internal framework has already accepted them. There is also no attempt to elevate the crimes into meaning. He does not frame them as messages, statements, or expressions of belief. He does not portray himself as driven by ideology, trauma, or destiny. The acts are presented as events that occurred, not as symbols requiring interpretation. For investigators, this creates a specific dynamic. There is information to be extracted, but no emotional leverage to apply. Traditional pressure tactics offer limited results. Barnum does not respond to confrontation, nor does he react to appeals for empathy. The interviews become transactional. Questions, answers, confirmation, documentation. This stage of the case is unsettling precisely because it lacks drama. There is no moment of breaking, no revelation that reframes everything. What emerges instead is continuity. The same emotional distance that defined Barnum's earlier life is present here, intact and unchallenged. He does not deny what happened. He does not dramatize it. He simply acknowledges it when it serves the process. By the end of the interrogations, investigators have what they need. Not because Barnum wants to be understood, but because the evidence no longer requires persuasion. The interviews do not humanize him. They do not demonize him further. They simply confirm what the case has been showing all along. Control was never lost. It was transferred. Jason Barnum's trial is not the kind that fills seats or generates dramatic soundbites. There is no circus atmosphere, no daily headlines tracking facial expressions or courtroom theatrics. From the start, the proceedings are restrained, deliberate, and heavily anchored in documentation. This is a case built to hold. The prosecution does not chase spectacle. There are no sweeping narratives about evil, no attempts to turn Barnum into a symbol or a monster larger than the facts. Instead, the strategy is simple and methodical. Establish what happened, link it to one individual, and do so in a way that leaves little room for collapse on appeal. Evidence comes first. Crime scene findings are presented carefully, without embellishment. Injury patterns, timelines, and locations are laid out step by step. The brutality is not hidden, but it is not sensationalized either. The court is shown exactly what investigators found, how conclusions were reached, and why the cases belong together. Witness testimony follows the same tone. There are no emotional performances, no dramatic turns. Statements are factual, often restrained. The focus remains on corroboration rather than persuasion. This is not about convincing a jury through shock. It is about making the case unavoidable. Barnum's behavior during the trial mirrors what investigators observed during interrogation. He does not react visibly to testimony. He does not seek eye contact with jurors. He does not interrupt, object emotionally, or attempt to project innocence through performance. He sits, he listens, he waits. There is no attempt to frame himself as misunderstood, no sudden references to childhood trauma, no last-minute psychological revelations meant to complicate responsibility. Barnum does not offer an alternative story. He allows the evidence to stand unchallenged in its core assertions. That silence is not dramatic, but it is consistent. The defense does not attempt to dismantle the case through grand counter-narratives. Instead, the focus is narrow. Procedure, admissibility, technical points that might weaken individual links. But the structure holds. The overlap between cases, the consistency of methods, and the accumulation of proof leave little space to maneuver. As the trial progresses, it becomes clear that this is not a question of if, but how firmly the outcome will be secured. There is no moment where the courtroom shifts emotionally. No gasp, no collective reaction that marks a turning point. The process advances steadily, almost quietly, toward its conclusion. This is justice without drama, and in many ways, that is what makes it unsettling. There is no catharsis here, no emotional release. The trial does not resolve the discomfort of the crimes. It formalizes it. It converts violence into records, testimony, and verdicts. By the time closing arguments arrive, the shape of the case is already fixed. The story has been told not through rhetoric, but through repetition and consistency. When the jury prepares to deliberate, there is no sense of suspense, only finality. The trial does not explain Jason Barnum. It does not attempt to. It does something far simpler, and far more important. It establishes responsibility beyond doubt. The sentencing phase does not change the tone of the case. There is no emotional pivot, no sudden moral reckoning that reframes what has already been established. What happens next is a continuation of the same procedural gravity that has defined everything since the investigation came together. Jason Barnum is sentenced to multiple life terms in prison, without the possibility of parole. The decision is firm, unambiguous, and designed to end the conversation rather than extend it. There is no attempt to balance punishment with rehabilitation, no language about potential future change. The court's message is simple. Barnum will not return to society. This is not a case where sentencing becomes a stage. Victim impact statements are handled with restraint. The focus remains on accountability rather than emotional display. The harm is acknowledged, but not transformed into spectacle. Barnum's reaction is minimal. He does not protest. He does not collapse. He does not speak in ways that demand attention. There is no visible outrage at the outcome, nor any attempt to appear misunderstood. If anything, his demeanor suggests recognition rather than resistance. The structure he has been moving within for months, investigation, interrogation, trial, now reaches its final configuration. Control is fully transferred. And importantly, the court does not pursue the death penalty. This choice is not framed as mercy, but as certainty. Life sentences remove ambiguity. They eliminate future hearings, appeals driven by time, or the slow drip of renewed public attention. The case is meant to close cleanly. From a legal standpoint, the sentence is airtight. From a narrative standpoint, it is deliberately unsatisfying. There is no moral crescendo here, no sense of balance restored. The crimes are not redeemed by the severity of the punishment. They are contained, nothing more. Once the sentence is handed down, Barnum becomes administratively invisible. There are no post-sentencing interviews, no statements to the press, no letters released to generate further interest. The system absorbs him and moves on. That quiet ending matters. True crime often teaches audiences to expect a moment where justice feels emotionally complete. This case offers no such moment. The sentence does not heal anything. It does not explain anything. It simply ensures that the violence stops permanently. Jason Barnum leaves the courtroom not as a symbol, not as a cautionary tale carefully packaged for consumption, but as a closed file. The story does not end with reflection or resolution, it ends with restriction. From this point forward, Barnum's life exists entirely within institutional boundaries. His name fades from public circulation. The crimes remain documented, but no longer active. What comes next is not part of the criminal process. It is the afterlife of incarceration, where meaning shrinks, visibility disappears, and identity is reduced to routine. There is no transition period where he remains visible to the public. No media follow-ups, no interviews reflecting on the outcome. The shift is immediate. From defendant to inmate, from courtroom presence to institutional routine, Barnum is transferred into the Florida prison system and placed in a high-security environment. The reasons are practical rather than symbolic. The severity of the crimes, the nature of the violence, and the risk profile attached to his case make close supervision necessary. This is not about notoriety. It is about containment. Life inside follows a rigid structure. Days are repetitive. Movement is regulated. Contact is limited. Decisions that once belonged to him, where to go, when to eat, how to exist in time, are no longer his to make. The external control that had been closing in throughout the investigation now becomes total. What stands out during this phase is Barnum's lack of visible resistance to the loss of autonomy. There are no documented disciplinary outbursts, no attempts to assert dominance through chaos, no dramatic refusal to comply. He does not appear to fight the structure, he adapts to it. From the outside, very little information emerges. Barnum does not seek correspondence with journalists. He does not cultivate relationships with true crime followers. He does not attempt to insert himself back into public conversation. In an era where many offenders maintain relevance through letters, statements, or indirect self-promotion, Barnum remains silent. This silence is consistent. He does not present himself as reformed. He does not present himself as wronged. He does not present himself at all. The system reduces him to an identification number, a schedule, a set of restrictions. And he appears to accept that reduction without protest. Whatever internal structure guided his actions before now exists within much narrower limits. At this stage, Barnum is no longer acting upon others. The capacity for harm is physically removed. What remains is internal. This is the point where many offenders begin to reshape their identity in response to confinement. Some turn outward, performing repentance or ideology. Others collapse inward. Barnum does neither publicly. He becomes difficult to track not because he is hidden, but because there is nothing to report. No events, no statements, no narrative. The crimes remain in records, the sentence remains fixed, and Barnum's presence fades into the background machinery of incarceration. What happens next does not occur quickly. It does not announce itself. But over time, one thing does change. Not his behavior toward the outside world, but his appearance. And that transformation does not serve an audience. It serves something else entirely. The most visible change in Jason Barnum does not happen before the crimes, during the investigation, or even at trial. It happens later, quietly, inside prison. During the time of his offences and court appearances, Barnum's appearance was unremarkable. No extreme tattoos, no constructed image, nothing that would later become associated with his name. The person who committed the crimes did not look like the figure people now picture when his mugshots circulate online. That shift comes after the verdict. In prison, Barnum's body becomes one of the few remaining spaces where choice still exists. Time is controlled, movement is controlled, social contact is controlled. Identity in every meaningful public sense is gone. What remains is the physical self. Over time, Barnum's appearance changes. Tattoos accumulate. The visual distance between who he was and who he becomes grows wider. This is not a transformation meant for an audience. There are no interviews timed to coincide with it, no statements explaining it, no attempt to rebrand himself. The change happens anyway. Psychologically, this makes sense. Prison strips individuals down to routine and repetition. For some inmates, appearance becomes a way to reclaim autonomy. The body turns into a canvas, a boundary, a statement, even if no one is meant to read it. In Barnum's case, the transformation does not signal a new ideology or belief system. There is no evidence of religious awakening or gang affiliation driving the change. It appears internal rather than performative. A way of reshaping identity in an environment where identity has been erased. Importantly, this look did not precede the violence. It did not cause the crimes. It followed them. That distinction matters, especially in visual-driven true crime culture. Barnum did not commit murder because he looked extreme. He began to look extreme after he no longer mattered to the outside world. The body became something to control when everything else was gone. This chapter is short because the facts are limited, and that too is telling. Barnum does not narrate this change. He does not frame it. He does not explain it. He simply inhabits it. The transformation is not a warning sign retroactively revealed. It is a consequence, and it sets the stage for the final phase of the story. Not about crimes, but about what remains when there is nothing left to take from the world. Once Jason Barnum enters the Florida prison system, his life narrows immediately. The sentence removes any sense of progression. There are no future hearings to anticipate, no milestones to reach, no realistic expectation of release. Time stops being directional. It becomes circular. Barnum is housed in a high-security environment, not because of celebrity or notoriety, but because of risk assessment. The severity of his crimes and the level of violence involved place him in a category where control and predictability matter more than rehabilitation or integration. Daily life follows a rigid structure. Movement is scheduled, meals are scheduled, recreation, when allowed, is regulated and limited. Privacy does not exist in any meaningful sense. Decisions that define normal adult life, when to leave a room, where to go, who to interact with, are no longer his to make. What is notable is how little friction Barnum appears to generate within this structure. There are no documented patterns of disciplinary escalation. no reputation for volatility, no reports of him attempting to dominate others through aggression or intimidation. He does not appear to seek status within the inmate hierarchy. He does not position himself as a figure of influence. In many ways, he becomes administratively quiet. Interaction with other inmates is limited, whether by placement or preference. Barnum does not form visible alliances, nor does he become a social presence within prison culture. He does not adopt a role: preacher, mentor, troublemaker, or victim. He exists within the system without reshaping it. This absence of behavior is not accidental. It mirrors the emotional flatness observed throughout the case. Barnum does not react strongly to confinement because he does not appear to rely on external stimulation or social validation. The loss of autonomy is total, but it does not provoke collapse or rebellion. Isolation, for him, does not appear to be punishment in the conventional sense. It is simply another controlled environment. There are no records of religious conversion, ideological alignment, or visible attempts at personal reinvention during this phase. Prison does not become a stage for self-explanation or moral transformation. It becomes a container. Barnum adapts to routine the way he adapted to detachment earlier in life, without drama, without visible resistance, without apparent urgency to be seen or understood. This chapter matters because it strips away expectation. Prison, in this case, does exactly what it is designed to do. It prevents further harm and removes the individual from circulation. Nothing inside transforms him. Nothing inside redeems him. Nothing inside escalates. Life continues in repetition, measured in counts and schedules rather than years. Jason Barnum does not fight the system. He disappears into it. By the time Jason Barnum's appearance begins to change, there is no stage left to perform on. The outside world is gone. The trial is over. Media interest has evaporated. There are no cameras, no courtrooms, no observers waiting for reactions. Whatever visual transformation happens next unfolds in a space defined by routine, restriction, and anonymity. This matters because it separates Barnum from a familiar category of offenders. Many inmates use prison as a second act. They write letters. They adopt belief systems. They cultivate personas that can travel beyond the walls. Some discover religion. Others discover ideology. Some discover an audience and lean into it hard. Barnum does none of that. As his appearance shifts, tattoos accumulating, features becoming more severe, there is no accompanying narrative, no explanation, no message attached. He does not claim the look as identity, protest, or rebirth. He does not contextualize it as meaning or growth. There is no audience to impress. This is not image management. It is not branding. There is no attempt to control how the outside world sees him, because the outside world is no longer relevant to his daily existence. The change is inward-facing. Prison removes almost every form of agency. Movement is dictated. Time is dictated. Interaction is dictated. For many inmates, the body becomes one of the last remaining territories where choice still exists. What happens to it, how it looks, how it is marked, is one of the few decisions that cannot be fully confiscated. In Barnum's case, the transformation does not signal a new role. It does not align him with a group or belief system. There is no evidence that it functions as intimidation, affiliation, or communication. It functions as control, not over others, but over self. This distinction is easy to miss when images circulate without context. A more extreme appearance invites interpretation. People assume intention, message, performance. But in Barnum's case, there is no indication that the look is meant to be read at all. He does not speak alongside it, he does not explain it, he does not defend it. The body becomes a closed system, not a broadcast. That silence is consistent with everything else. Barnum never sought recognition for what he did. He never shaped a narrative around himself. Even now, with a more visually striking presence, he remains absent from the conversation that image invites. There is no reclamation of identity here, no reinvention for consumption. Just a person adjusting to confinement by exerting control where control is still possible. The look exists, but it points nowhere. And that is what makes it unsettling. Not because it signifies danger, but because it signifies nothing at all. When an offender builds an image without an audience, it stops being performance. It becomes residue. As Jason Barnum fades into the prison system, something else fades with him. The public memory of the people he killed. This is not because their deaths were insignificant. It is because the structures that shape attention rarely linger on victims who lived at the margins. The men Barnum murdered did not have loud platforms in life, and they did not gain them in death. Once the trial ended, their names largely disappeared from headlines, replaced by a single, offender-focused label. That imbalance is not unique to this case, but it is central to it. During the investigation and trial, victims are necessarily present in records, testimony, and evidence. Their lives are reduced to timelines, circumstances, and forensic details. After sentencing, even that limited visibility contracts. What remains are case numbers and archive documents, not stories that continue to circulate. There are no widely known memorials tied to this case, no recurring anniversaries covered by media, no sustained public effort to center the victims' identities. Instead, attention consolidates around the offender, his name, his crimes, his appearance, because that is where narrative momentum tends to settle. It is easier to follow a single figure than to hold space for multiple disrupted lives, especially when those lives were already socially fragile. This creates a second disappearance. The first disappearance happens when violence removes someone from the world. The second happens when the world moves on without learning who they were. In Barnum's case, this dynamic is particularly stark. The victims' marginalization did not begin with their deaths. It existed long before. Limited family networks, unstable living situations, and reduced institutional visibility meant that their loss did not generate the same sustained response afforded to others. That reality does not excuse the delay in recognition. It explains how silence persists. True crime often claims to honor victims, but structurally it gravitates toward perpetrators. The story becomes easier to tell when it revolves around one name, one face, one evolving image. The people harmed become context rather than center. This chapter exists to interrupt that pattern, even briefly. The victims are not footnotes to Barnum's actions. They are the reason the story exists at all. Their absence is the actual loss, not the disappearance of the offender from public view. When cases like this close, justice is measured legally. Sentences imposed, files sealed, danger removed. But remembrance is not part of the legal process. It depends on collective attention, and that attention is selective. In the end, Jason Barnum is contained, monitored, and named. The men he killed are not. Their lives do not become symbols. Their names do not circulate. Their stories do not continue. And that quiet erasure is not an accident. It is part of how these cases end, not with a resolution, but with forgetting. By the time Jason Barnum's name disappears from headlines, what remains is mostly imagery. Mugshots, prison photos, screenshots passed around without context, a face that looks harsher than it once did, carrying meanings people are quick to project onto it. That is where this case is easiest to misunderstand. Barnum is not dangerous because of how he looks now. He never was. The extreme appearance people fixate on developed after the crimes, after the arrest, after the sentence. It did not precede the violence, predict it, or announce it. It followed containment. It followed disappearance from public life. Treating it as a warning sign retroactively flips cause and effect. The real danger in this case never announced itself visually. It existed in absence, in detachment, in a quiet willingness to reduce other people to objects. There were no dramatic signals to decode, no ideology to quote, no aesthetic that screamed threat. Barnum moved through the world looking ordinary enough to be ignored. And that ordinariness is precisely what allowed harm to unfold without immediate interruption. This is why the case resists myth. There is no rise and fall arc, no transformation from monster in waiting to revealed villain. No cinematic moment where everything suddenly makes sense. The system worked eventually. The violence stopped. The offender was removed. But the story does not end with understanding. It ends with containment and limits. Barnum does not offer lessons in the way popular true crime prefers. He does not provide a checklist, a profile you can spot in a crowd, or a look you can learn to fear. If anything, the case argues against that impulse. Danger does not always look like spectacle. It does not always demand attention. It does not always perform. Sometimes it exists quietly, embedded in routine, shielded by invisibility and structural gaps. Sometimes it passes through systems not because those systems fail, but because they are designed to respond to noise, not silence. Jason Barnum is now fixed in place. He will not re-enter society. He will not shape his own narrative. He will not return as a cultural figure unless others keep dragging him back into view. What matters more is what doesn't continue. The victims do not get new chapters. The crimes do not evolve into something else. The story does not expand. It closes. Not with meaning. Not with symbolism. But with a reminder that the most unsettling cases are often the ones that refuse to become stories at all. And that is where this one ends. Alright, sleepless rabble, that's where we leave it. No cliffhanger. No moral lesson neatly tied with a bow. Just a case that ends the way it lived. Quietly, contained, and unresolved in all the ways that matter. If you're still here, you already know the deal. If this story stayed with you, let the algorithm know you were here too. A like helps more than you think, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one when it drops. If you want to say something, keep it human. Thoughts, reactions, or simply where you're listening from, all welcome. And if you want to support what we're doing without ads, without noise, and without nonsense, you'll find us at ko-fi.com/Napmax. This was Napmax Sleep Stories. Thank you for listening, and until next time, sleep well or don't.